So welcome everyone to the first ever virtual visual session of the Marlboro College Alumni Speakers Series. My name is Maia Segura. I've been the Alumni Director at Marlboro for just under 2 years, and it's my honor to be an alumna of the class of 1991. This series began live on the Marlboro campus just over a year ago. And through it, we've been able to feature over a dozen remarkable alums working in areas such as academia, publishing, public radio, and sustainable business development. Tonight, we have with us author, journalist, columnist, TV correspondent, lecturer, and professor Arthur Magida of the class of 1967. Arthur, you want to give a little wave there? Got a wave? Good job. Arthur is listed in Who's Who in America, Who's Who in Religion, and Writers Who's Who, and has appeared on numerous television and radio shows, including Dateline, the CBS Early Show, PBS's The McNeil-Lehrer News Hour, ABC's World News Tonight, C-SPAN's Book Notes, and NPR's Morning Edition. He's received 16 Simon Rockower Awards from the American Jewish Press Association, 5 A.D. Emmert Awards for writing on the humanities, and many other awards for journalism and humanitarian work. When at Marlboro, he started his lifelong love affair with history and writing. His plan, with the great Dick Jug as his advisor, was regarding the progressive era of the early 20th century, which laid the foundation for a stronger, more muscular federal government. And without those progressives, quite possibly there would have been no New Deal, no Square Deal, and no Great Society. Tonight, Arthur will talk about his forthcoming work, codenamed Madeleine, a Sufi Spy in Nazi-occupied Paris, which will be released on June 9th from W.W. Norton. Co-hosting with me today is Ian McManus, Marlboro College Professor of Comparative Politics. Hey, Ian, thank you. And the structure for the event will be a presentation and reading by Arthur, discussion with Ian, and then we will take questions from the attendees. Please be patient with us. This is our first time trying this, and there'll probably be some mistakes. Wanted to talk about a couple of little housekeeping issues as we get to the Q&A portion of the event. Please type your questions into the box that pops up when you click the Q&A icon that is likely at the top or bottom of your screen. We may not be able to answer all of your questions, but we will get to as many as possible, and we may also sort of group some of your questions together depending on the subject matter. Also, we understand that you are signing on to Zoom from different makes and models of laptops and tablets, so the views and functions may vary a bit for you personally, and you are the only one who can choose your view. But most of you will find the option for a gallery view or a speaker view. For sure, we recommend that you watch this via full screen. So, without further ado, welcome Arthur Magida.
And without further ado, thank you, Maia Segura. And also thank you, Ian, who we will not only see in a little while, but we will hear from in a while. And thank you, Marlboro College, for hosting this event. As Maia said, this is our first Zooming. There may be some goofs and snafus along the way, but a very good friend emailed me earlier a very short verse from the Quran that has immense bearing upon what we're doing, and that is, no soul is tasked beyond its capacity. So we will not be straining too much. All of this, I pray, is within our capacity. Tonight has a special meaning for me. It incorporates beginnings and ends, starts and finishes, pasts and presents, and a future that's barely imaginable weeks into a pandemic, but for which I hope Noor Inayat Khan, who brought us all together tonight, can provide some guidance and some solace. Noor, N-O-O-R, means light. These are dark times. We need as much light as we can gather, and from whatever source it comes. For me, Marlboro also provided light, the light of a unique, rare, once-in-a-lifetime experiment in democracy, in freedom, in innovation, and you betcha, in fun. Marlboro, as we've known it, will soon be extinguished. It may arise in a different form, in a different place. We will see. Noor was extinguished. She was extinguished at Dhaka. But she too has persisted and survived in a very different form. She has not gone and she has not disappeared. A Hasidic saying states, if you want to find a spark, sift through the ashes. Tonight, we'll sift through the ashes. Noor's ashes at Dhaka. Marlboro certainly is not ashes, but it's seeking a new reincarnation. I know along the way, as we sift through these ashes of sorts, we will find sparks like that Hasidic rabbi promised and intuited. But first, who is Noor? Well, for that, I'm going to need Maia's assistance. Hit it, Maia, with any technology you have on your end, because that's your task now, not mine. There's my book, Code Name Madeleine, soon to be released by W.W. Norton and available in bookstores all around the country or online, wherever you prefer to purchase a book. Noor. Once upon a time, there was a princess, a Sufi, an Islamic mystic named Noor Inayat Khan, a young woman who saw the world coming apart and tried to heal it. Noor was a true global citizen. Her mother, Maia, please, next slide. Her mother, Aura, was an American who lived first in Arizona and then in New York with her brother. Noor's father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, Maia, Hazrat Inayat Khan, through whom Noor inherited her regal lines, was not only an Indian, but also the man who introduced Sufism to the West in 1910. And Noor herself, next slide, was born in Moscow in 1914. New slide. She was raised in London, and there she is with her father shortly after she was born in Moscow. Raised in London and then in a spiritual cocoon in Suran, a small village directly west of Paris. Together, all this, an American mother, an Indian father, a Russian birth, and a French and a British upbringing made Noor American, Indian, Russian, British, French, as united a blend of nations as could be found in just about any one individual. Somehow, Noor held all that together, integrating all those nations and cultures and traditions into unique, distinct personality, and transmitting herself and transmuting herself into one of the most unlikely undercover agents of World War II. Unlikely because Noor was as ethereal an agent as any side fielded during the war. Thanks to her father, the Sufi master, Noor practiced a very sensible, non-transcendental mysticism. To become an angel is not very difficult, her father taught. To live in the world, in all the difficulties and struggles of the world, and to be human at the same time, that is very difficult. If we become that, he said, then we become the miniature of God on earth. For Noor and her father, spirituality did not reside in another realm. It was here, it was now, and it was real. Noor grew into a deceptively strong-willed young woman. She wrote music, poetry, children's short stories, essays about faith and religion, and always chose to put others before herself. In fact, service was a keystone of her faith. For her, and to use her words right now, the essence of spirituality and mysticism is a readiness to serve the person next to us. Noor's mysticism did not renounce the world. It embraced it with all its messiness and all its possibilities and all its pleasures and all its joys, all its disappointments and all its triumphs. Everything was grist for Noor's mill, and everything she absorbed and interpreted through her rare and unique prism. So when the time came to serve during World War II, Noor was ready to become the most improbable agent in Britain's top secret agency, the Strategic Operations Executive, SOE for short. Noor was improbable because she was diminutive, 5 feet 4 and barely 100 pounds, about as slight as it comes. And improbable an agent because the SOE didn't habitually recruit shy, quiet, introspective mystics. Even more improbable because it didn't usually send on missions agents whose trainers said they were not overburdened with brains, as one of Noor's handlers said about her. This guy didn't like the idea of women doing men's work, espionage, sabotage, working behind enemy lines. That was only for the guys. Despite that, in June 1943, Noor was the first female radio operator the SOE flew into France, holding the Gestapo at bay for months while lugging her 30-pound radio with her just about wherever she went, and never varying from the ethical principles of Sufism she'd learned from her father. And when she was finally caught, Noor told the Germans nothing, and she won their respect even after trying to escape twice from a Gestapo prison in the center of Paris. Maia, next slide, if you will, please. Maia, the next slide. There's another, there we go. That's where she was held in Paris. That's 84 Avenue Foch. That was a very elaborate mansion before the war on both sides. More elaborate mansions. The Gestapo took it over from the first floor all the way to the 5th. Noor was caught October 43. She was taken to 84 Avenue Foch. Went straight up to the top floor of the 5th. She was interrogated for a few hours. The Germans did not learn anything from her. They never learned anything from her. And after a while, they decided to give her a break. They wanted to take her to her cell. But Noor said, no, she really needed a bath first. And this was like early to mid-afternoon. The Germans thought it was a little bit strange that this young woman wanted a bath so early in the day. But they had not been getting anywhere with her with the questioning. They thought they would humor her just a little bit. They pointed to the bathroom. Noor went in there. There was a brick keeping the door open, just a bit, because the Gestapo always wanted to see what people were doing in that room. Noor insisted they close it. Gestapo said no. Noor insisted again. They took the brick away and they closed it. She was in there for a while. At some point, a Gestapo agent opened one of those windows up on that 5th floor, looked out, and he saw Noor balancing on the rain gutter. If we were doing this in person, I would point to that rain gutter with a laser light. I don't have one handy, but if you can see like a ridge just below those top windows, there was Noor balancing and hoping to get away. The Gestapo agent talked her back in. After Noor's second attempt from the same prison, this time by scrambling across rooftops and down balconies to the street, she was sent to a prison in Germany, where she was locked up in solitary and shackled, wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle, both of those sets of chains linked together so she could barely stand. 10 months later, Noor was taken to Dachau. The next day, in a shallow pit about 100 feet from Dachau's crematorium, she was executed with a bullet to her head. Maya, if you will, the next slide. Thank you very much. This actually was at a memorial service for Noor about 2 years ago at Dhaka. Noor served willingly and wholeheartedly and with a bravery and a spiritual perspective that were uncommon throughout the war. Noor's perspective confounded a friend of mine who's a psychologist. He insisted that Noor had a death wish, an irrational impulse to extinguish herself. I told my friend there was nothing irrational about what Noor did. Yes, she knew that radio operators were the linchpin of the SOE. Without them, the agency could not have communicated with the agents it smuggled into Europe, coordinating activities, planning strategy, dropping supplies and money. And Noor knew that the average lifespan of a radio operator in France was 6 weeks. Noor, by the way, lasted 4 months, not the usual 6 weeks. But she believed, to quote Noor, that sacrificing yourself for others bathes the world in a love which purifies and heals the suffering of humanity. Sacrificing yourself for others bathes the world in love. This was not how undercover agents usually talked. Noor's goal was not to eliminate herself, as my friend the psychologist thought. Her goal was to heal the world, to ease its suffering. Noor did not have a death wish. She had a life wish. While researching Codename Madeleine, I was struck by a phrase Noor wrote when she was in her mid-20s. The heart must be broken for the real to come forth. World War II broke Noor's heart, and the real came forth. In a world torn apart, Noor found her destiny, and she found her calling. That's why hers is a story of courage, faith, resilience, a story that inspired those who knew her, and a story that can inspire us in our own chaotic, troubling, and thanks to the pandemic now, tragic age. The heart must be broken for the real to come forth. It's my favorite quote from Noor. It's as true today as it was more than 7 decades after Noor wrote it. Every day, for many of us, our hearts are broken. Every day, the real comes forth. And every day we are summoned to bring forth the best in ourselves, much as Noor did. Among the many treats of writing this book was discovering extraordinary stories wherever I looked. Stories that had never been told before, stories that gave the arc of Noor's life new and intriguing possibilities. A few examples. Maia, if you will, the next slide. A young girl with a white bow in her hair. There she is, Noor, maybe 5 years old. Because I had access to Noor's report cards, I discovered that her talent for writing and storytelling was noticed as early as kindergarten. That's when her teacher praised her for how well she listens and enjoys stories and can tell one herself. Other than that, Noor had some of the main faults that all the rest of us did in that grade. She was too talkative, her teacher complained. She had difficulty concentrating, and her mind, one teacher stated, needed steadying and strengthening. As her life went on, Noor more than made up for this. Without a steady, strong mind, the Gestapo would have caught Noor days after she arrived in Paris, not months after she got there. Noor's father, one of India's foremost musicians, came to the West in 1910 to perform and also to learn about Western music, not to teach Sufism, that came later. But I discovered that the club where he performed in Moscow in 1914 was owned by the African-American son of former slaves in Mississippi. a guy named Frederick Bruce Thomas. Thomas bought the club about 10 years after his parents purchased a farm in the Deep South after the Civil War. Then they moved to Memphis after a white man swindled them out of their 200 acres, and Thomas's father was murdered, and Thomas's mother barely got by. And Thomas, tired of being humiliated, headed north, working at odd jobs in St. Louis, Chicago, New York, and other cities, and as a waiter, butler, head waiter all over Europe. Finally, he put down roots in Moscow, bought a club called Maxim. A year later, Noor's father was playing his vina, which is sort of like a sitar, every night at 11 p.m. to these smoke-filled lounges full of affluent Russians lounging on chairs and ogling some of the very lovely women in the room. An African American, the son of former slaves, owning a nightclub in Moscow where one of India's finest musicians performed, blew me away. This was not how the world was supposed to operate. I also, in my book, quoted from letters that were never used before, especially Noor's letters to Azim, her fiance for almost 6 years during the 1930s. Her family opposed the engagement, and every summer Noor's brother Vilayat took her on vacations, whose ulterior motive was to give him a chance to talk her out of marrying Azim. Noor did break up with Azim. She did it on her own volition when it was apparent there would be a war, and she would serve as a nurse in it. She felt she could devote herself better to nursing and to being in a war zone if she didn't have to worry about taking care of herself, so she could return to Azim, her beloved. I also learned that in 1940, Noor and her mother and 2 siblings fled from the Germans in her brother's MG. Next slide, Maya, thank you. How was that possible? 4 people in an MG? As far as I knew, I didn't know much, MGs, this tiny little British sports car, had room for 2 passengers, not 4. After tracking down the head of the MG Car Club Limited in England, I learned that MG had produced models with jump seats between 1922 to 1933. And after more digging, I learned that Noor's mother sat in the front passenger seat. Noor's mother drove, and Noor and her sister Claire sat behind them in the jump seat. In my book, I say the MG was a great car for a jolly picnic in the country, not for fleeing from the Nazis. Next slide, Maya. An open-air sports car. MGs were made for rallies and for flirting with girls in Piccadilly or at Ascot. They weren't intended for joining a long line of refugees who were escaping to the coast while the Germans strafed them from the air. Soon after leaving Suresnes, the town opposite Paris where the family lived, Noor's brother turned the car onto roads filled with broken down cars and broken down people. Maya, next slide, thank you. And roads filled with infantrymen humiliated by their rout, and dead horses lying in ditches, and thousands of people on bicycles weaving in and out of the rabble, and farm wagons piled high with tables and chairs and suitcases, and a grandmother being pushed in a wheelbarrow. There was a man carrying a cat, a woman carrying a bird in a cage, mothers pushing babies in prams, children carrying toys, dolls, blankies. Cars overheated or crept along. The flood of humanity was too dense for the autos to move any faster. And everywhere, mattresses were lashed to the tops of Renaults and Citroëns and Mercedes. On the top of one car, the body of a grandmother who had died en route was tied to a mattress because her son could not bear to leave her alongside the road. The MG maneuvered around large stones that had been thrown on the road. fruitless attempts to block German tanks. Germans in Messerschmitt circled above, unsure whether to strafe the refugees or let them collapse in exhaustion. Leaving the MG and Tours with a friend, the Khans found seats on a train. The train, Noor wrote, was noisy and crowded with frantic young mothers and tear-strained eyes carrying their sleeping youngsters. They knew not where they were heading, Noor wrote. They were just running toward freedom if freedom was to be found. For the little ones, Noor said, France should be saved from enemy hands at any price. I have wiped the eyes of some, given water to others. The distress of a human being is impressive, Noor concluded. But the distress of a whole nation? Those whose hearts have not beaten and suffered with this cannot know what it means, nor knew what it meant. I'm convinced that sitting in the jump seat of that MG, while passing thousands of refugees and looking them in the eye one after another and wiping the eyes of those children on the train, all that strengthened the pledge that Noor had made to herself and to one of her brothers. Somehow, she would return to France to fight the Germans. I also learned in the course of researching my book that after the SOE flew Noor into France in 1943, she knocked on neighbors' doors in the village where she lived before the war, hoping somebody would let her send messages to England from their home. Noor didn't know that she was surrounded by Germans in a massive 19th century fort a few blocks away, a fort where Noor's brothers and sister had played as children. The Germans were executing members of the resistance. Next slide, Maia. And we will now see that fort and an execution a few blocks away from where Noor was when she came back to Surin that August in 43, when Noor was begging neighbors to let her use her radio from their homes. Joseph Axelrod was executed here, and Marcel Cornillon, and Jules Godfrey, and Jules Diane, and Michel Legois, and more. The next month, September, Abel Blanchard and Marcel Bernard, and more were killed. And by the end of the war, almost 1,200 Frenchmen were killed in that fort. Noor also didn't know that every time she returned to the home that did let her transmit messages to England, she walked through a gauntlet of Germans. 33 Gestapo agents were living on that same block. 28 were living in Noor's family home, which was right around the corner. More were living in 17 other homes a block away. Everywhere Noor walked, there were Germans. I also discovered that one of the stories we've heard about how the Allies conducted the war is essentially a myth, that the Allies did everything they could to protect Paris, and that it was Hitler, and Hitler alone, who was determined to desecrate the world's most beautiful city by blowing up its finest museums as the Germans were retreating after D-Day. We never hear about the Allied bombing in 1943, 1944, sometimes twice a day, sometimes more. Factories and car plants were the prime targets, but the bombing was notoriously inaccurate, as all bombing is. Bombs intended for a factory missed their target, killing 300 civilians, injuring 400 more. A bomb smashed into a metro station, killing 80 people. Another bomb killed 7 people at a racetrack. Noor, I wrote in my book, heard the bombs. Everyone did. Possibly she saw the damage. Many people did. But Noor had worries beyond the bombs. Every second, she had to be alert, aware, awake. A few weeks after she was flown into France, she was barely getting any rest, not with constantly running around trying to find a safe house from which to send messages to England and reconstructing cells which the Germans had wrecked soon after she arrived, and retrieving coded messages from secret drop boxes scattered all over the city. And speaking of bombs, for most of the war, the Allies spared the German city of Pforzheim. That's where Noor was imprisoned after her second escape attempt from that prison in Paris, the one we saw just a few minutes ago. But in 1944, I learned American planes repeatedly attacked Pforzheim. Noor's prison was a few blocks away from some of the worst bombing. Prison shook with every explosion. In her cell, Noor remained in solitary and in chains. The Germans gave Noor no reprieve from the hell they locked her up in. She stayed that way for 10 months. But what for Noor did fighting the Germans mean? Could we have the next slide, Maya? Thank you very much. There. Fighting meant never forgetting she was a Sufi. Never forgetting the rules of chivalry her father had laid down when Noor was 12. The rules emphasize modesty, humility, empathy, and discipline. Do not neglect those who depend upon you. Bear no malice against your worst enemy. Hold your head high in all circumstances. Consider duty as sacred as religion. This was a knighthood of conscience, spirit, courage, and persistence. Another rule was to harm no one for your own benefit. Many people have called Noor a pacifist. She wasn't. She didn't believe in violence and she tried to avoid it, but she didn't fully believe in passive resistance either. And while Noor admired Gandhi's campaign for India's independence, she knew that pacifism had its limits. Fighting the British as a pacifist, like Gandhi did, made sense. Fighting Hitler as a pacifist was suicide. Further souring Noor and Gandhi was his cavalier attitude towards the Nazis. Gandhi urged Jews in Europe to pray for Hitler and to resist him without violence, though that would guarantee their massacre. Massacre is Gandhi's word, not mine. He knew what was up ahead. And he urged the British to stop fighting, though he knew a Nazi victory would cost the British their lives and their homes. And Gandhi repeatedly offered to mediate between the Allies and Hitler, who Gandhi stated was not a bad man. Noor knew that Hitler was a bad man. She knew how the Nazis were treating the Jews, yet her infatuation with pacifism was sufficient for her brother to question if it would force her to remain neutral during the war. Can we just stand by and watch what the Nazis are doing, he asked his sister. If Nazis came to the door, took 20 people who they planned to kill, would you be an accomplice in their deaths if nonviolence stopped you from killing the Germans and preventing those deaths? Noor couldn't stand by and watch. That's why she ended up in the jump seat of her brother's MG, hoping somehow to get to England and from England back to France. Noor was ideal for the SOE, the Strategic Operations Executive. She knew French and she knew France. She was brave, braver than she seemed when the SOE first recruited her. But to be a good agent, Noor had to bend one of her father's cardinal principles: never lie. Her father taught, true religion is the sea of truth. What begins in deception ends in deception. Well, maybe, but undercover agents can't be truthful. Without deceit, without guile, an agent was a dud, probably a dead dud. The SOE flew Noor into France anyway on June 16th, 1943. What happened that night? Noor's pilot was Frank Reimels, one of the RAF's best. He had 2 passengers. One he dismissed almost immediately. She looked like a vicar's wife, Reimels later said, and her French wasn't all that hot. The other, Noor, was, as I wrote, a lot more intriguing. Her light brown skin, her good looks, her vague and not quite placeable accent puzzled Reimels as much as his inability to figure out why someone so easy to spot was being sent to France. The general thinking in the SOE was that the less interesting an agent, the easier it was for her to blend in. The best agents, in fact, were so bland that they rarely got a second look. Noor warranted attention, and invariably she got it. One SOE agent who trained with Noor called her a splendid, vague, dreamy creature, far too conspicuous. Twice seen, never forgotten. Past midnight, Reimels approached a landing field northeast of the town of Angers. As Noor scrambled out of his plane, she clutched her pistol. She wasn't afraid to use it. Shooting, she'd written in an essay she'd never shown anyone during her SOE training, was like meditating. Both demanded fierce, intense concentration. Both narrowed your attention to what Noor called the pure essence of your task, focusing one's mind in a certain direction until there was no distinction between outer and inner, other and self. Soon Noor was on her way to a safe house in Paris, perhaps remembering that her father had wondered in one of his lectures if it wasn't bad for children to play with tin soldiers. His answer was surprising. Even toys can prepare us for the harshness of life, for vicissitudes that some mystics pretend don't exist or that they say can be transcended by burrowing into our own personal nirvana. But Noor's father was a practical mystic. He didn't seek students who yearned for an elusive transcendentalism that could buffer them from the rigors of this world. He taught that the value of meeting the quotidian challenges of life with the wholeness of one's spirit and the truth of one's soul. That's what we needed. He also knew that the price of defending a country's safety, dignity, and honor could be war and it could be death. Unsettling confessions for a man of peace and a man of God. Within a week after Noor landed in the countryside in France, and after she was escorted to Paris by a member of the resistance, the Germans caught almost everyone in Noor's cell. She was essentially on her own now. And that's when her real adventure began, when she truly encountered the cost of her mission. And Noor, I wrote, knew that we pay a price in life, the price we pay to receive life. If paying that price, she said, was not the highest and most inconceivable joy, then it was not a willing offering. In the middle of June 1943, when Noor was flown into France, the price she had paid in life, the gifts she'd offered the world, were mostly her music and her stories and her love for others. In Paris that summer, hiding and on the run from the Germans, she began to more fully appreciate that the most profound gift was what she called expressed in sacrifice. Most sacrifices, Noor believed, were relatively small, often involving wealth or material possessions. But the greatest sacrifice, she said, was the sacrifice of oneself. The best and the truest, a sacrifice for humanity. That's one of the key lessons we can learn from Noor, and why for a page or two in my book, when I bring up Noor's idea of sacrifice, the action essentially stops, and there's a lot of action in this book. I want my readers like Noor to ask themselves, do we have courage? Are we willing to make sacrifices? Are we willing to make the final sacrifice? Well, I hope, I hope that's what readers will ask themselves. In Paris, Noor built new cells. She ensured that money and arms kept flowing to the resistance. She sent messages to London about German troop movements and which factories and airports should be bombed, and about the frequencies the Germans were using to communicate with their submarines, and more. One of her messages was indispensable to D-Day, which was still a year away. She asked London to send a plane to pick up 2 French agents. They had a map of German defenses in Brittany. 2 weeks before D-Day, 3 French paratroopers from England jumped into Brittany, teamed up with the resistance, dynamited petrol dumps, and destroyed most of the Nazis' communication network in the region. This slowed down 100,000 German troops desperate to get to Normandy on D-Day and stop the Allied soldiers who were pouring into France. Noor's contributions to victory were indispensable, and they are largely unknown. One member of the resistance who was especially close to Noor was a man named Pierre Vianot. He was only 3 years older than her, but he kept a very close eye on her and helped her whenever he could. When her radio broke, he got it fixed in his electronics factory. When she needed a place to send messages from, he let her use his apartment. And he thought fast when she needed to keep her cover hidden from Germans or from collaborators. One day, Noor and Pierre Vianot were sitting on a small patio outside a cafe at 119 Rue Saint-Lazare, a cafe called Au Rue de la Bière, or at the King of Beer. Anybody who looked at the exterior of that cafe had a hard time not smiling. I've seen it. I had a hard time not smiling, I assure you. On the second floor facade was a statue of the King of Beer himself, lifting a stein of his favorite bear. Another sculpture, a large white stork, perched way up on the chimney. Underneath all this whimsy, Noor and Pierre Vianot spoke of matters serious and grim and very secretive. Everything was going well until Vianot looked up. He saw his uncle approaching them. His uncle favored Pétain, the puppet Germans had installed to run the free zone in southern France. Vianot did not want to give his uncle a chance to look at Noor, size her up, hear her accent, which was a little bit odd, sort of a combination of Indian American, French, English accents. Suddenly and very, very impulsively, Pierre Vianot took Noor by the waist, leaned over as if he was about to kiss her. His uncle walked by as if he'd seen nothing, and in fact, he did. When Vianot got home an hour later, his uncle was there. He'd already told Vianot's wife what he'd witnessed. Pierre Vianot kissing a very lovely woman outside a cafe. Elizabeth, the wife, was furious, and a row ensued between the two of them. The couple made up when Pierre's uncle left, and Pierre could finally tell his wife the truth. And by the way, I've located that cafe in Paris. King of Bear is still on the second floor facade. The large white stork is still up on the roof. It's now a McDonald's. And when it was apparent that the Gestapo was getting closer to Noor, Vianot told Noor to change her appearance, stop wearing that Macintosh she'd been seen in it all over Paris, and dye her hair a different color, and get away from that blue you wear every day. Friend of Vianot's took Noor shopping and to a hairdresser. By the time they were done, I wrote, Vianot almost didn't recognize her. Pleated skirt, broad-brimmed hat, tailored coat made her fashionable and chic. Her hair was now a light brown, complemented her eyes, and her olive skin flowed and rippled after the hairstylist had applied lotions and shampoos. Vianot was pleased, but he had one problem with Noor's new look. As before, everything she wore was blue. Even with the Germans closing in, Noor couldn't shake her habits or her vanity. She wanted to look good, even though she was on the Nazis' most wanted list. One day, Noor defended a member of the resistance who others were saying had betrayed her to the Gestapo. I can't believe he would do it, Noor kept repeating. No, 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 I didn't think he would do it, not him, never. Maybe, she said, the resistance had acted like that because the Gestapo had threatened his wife or his young son. We don't know all that happened, Noor said. We must not judge. Even while trying to stay one step ahead of the Gestapo, Noor remained a devout Sufi, a Sufi who did not judge. We cannot judge the actions of another, Noor believed. We can only say, I must not do this. When we judge someone, she maintained, we may easily be wrong. Noor refused to be wrong. Noor never lost her faith in her faith. When she was caught after trying to escape a second time from that Gestapo prison in Paris, she was given a choice. If she gave her word of honor not to escape again, she could remain in that fairly comfortable prison. Noor couldn't do that. Her honor was sacred. Her honor was her bond. Her father had taught, break not your word of honor, whatever may befall. By refusing to lie, Noor became the first British agent to be sent to a prison in Germany, and one of the few locked up under Hitler's Night and Fog decree. Night and Fog prisoners were shorn of their names. They were confined to cold cells. They almost starved. The Nazis said that in the fog and in the night, prisoners would vanish without a trace. In a German prison, Noor would vanish. There are a few details about how Noor handled her 10 months in Pforzheim, the German prison where she was sent. She couldn't talk with anyone. She couldn't see anyone. She couldn't write. She wasn't given anything to read. Quite likely, she retreated into herself. Before the war, in fact, she'd written that solitude was a way to know what she called her true self. Everyone, she believed, descends into a darkness before realization shall come. In the darkness of Pforzheim, Noor would have tested that conviction. We do know that 6 months after Noor was sent to Pforzheim, a guard noted that, quote, her state of mind has worsened considerably. She is not able to read German books. There's nothing for her to do. She is left alone. She is left to herself. The guard did hear Noor murmur, my loneliness is unbearable. The rest of Noor's murmuring was jumbled and incoherent. On September 12th, 1944, a train took Noor and 3 other female agents to Dachau. Reports vary about what happened next. Maybe they were executed that night, maybe the next morning. Whenever it happened, most likely Noor was killed by a bullet to her head as she held hands with another woman. She was 30 years old. If Noor spent the night of September 12th at Dachau, as one account states, the cell would have been a few doors down from that of Martin Niemöller. Niemöller was a Lutheran pastor who opposed the Nazis' takeover of churches in Germany. After the war, he gained fame for his confession about the timidity that had contaminated Germans during Hitler's reign. Some of you may know this. Niemöller wrote, first they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. At Dachau, no one spoke for Noor. Maya, if we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. The best stories sneak up on us out of nowhere. Noor sneaked up on me. I had never heard about her until I got a PR release from a friend about 7, 8 years ago at this point. Basically, this was about a documentary that he and his company had made for PBS. It's called Enemy of the Reich. I read simply the first paragraph and I was hooked. Mentioned Noor, who I never heard of, but it also mentioned her father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, the Sufi master who I mentioned before. I was very familiar with him because I've done a lot of work in spirituality. I knew what he taught, I knew what he meant to people. And as the PR release continued, it said that Hazrat's daughter, Noor, had been a secret agent, that she had given all sorts of important information to the Allies, in particular the British, that she was killed at Dachau, and that her spirit lives on very much. And that hooked me right there. I was then professor at a local university here in Baltimore. I had a screening of this PBS documentary, Enemy of the Reich. We had on the panel a Holocaust scholar, one of the producers of the film, and a Sufi scholar as well. And as I prepared for that evening, I did a lot of research on Noor, and I concluded, yeah, a lot's been written about her, but I thought almost all of it was severely lacking. So I decided to write a book. A few weeks after I made that decision, I emailed Noor's nephew, a wonderful man named Pirzia. He's a Sufi master in upstate New York. And he agreed to sit down with me. I needed to meet somebody from the family. I wanted some more first-hand material about Noor. About a week before I went up to New Lebanon, New York, where the abode of the message is located, I emailed Pirzia. I asked him if he knew of any Sufi teachings that may possibly have sustained Noor while she was held in this horrible Nazi prison for 10 months. He sent me a verse in the Bhagavad Gita that he had heard help Noor. I was curious about what a different translation would have said. So I pulled my own translation, my own issue of the Bhagavad Gita down from my shelf. Eloquent translation by an Oxford Don. I flipped through it until I finally found the verse that Pirzia had sent me, and I was completely stunned. I had not opened my own Bhagavad Gita for many years. Many years ago, I had marked in pencil only one verse in the Gita, the same passage that had helped Noor while she was in that prison. It reads, "In the bonds of work, I am free. The man who can see this truth, in his work, he finds freedom. He's free from all bonds. His mind has found peace in wisdom, and his work is a holy sacrifice. The work of such a man is pure." The verse teaches that sacrificing yourself for others can lead to enlightenment, that work with no ego attached to it is liberating and freeing. This was the essence of Noor's character: love, and selflessness, and sacrifice. I did have an interview soon after that with Pirzia at the abode of the message, and halfway through it, I reached into my backpack. I pulled out my volume of the Bhagavad Gita. I thought he would get a kick when I showed him that I had put brackets around this same verse a long time ago. Found the page in the book, was about to hand it to Pirzia when I stopped in mid-air. I realized that many years ago, I didn't just put brackets around that verse. I had also written liberty in the margin. Then I handed it to Pirzia, And with almost a shrug, he said, "Of course you did." Because Noor's last word before she was killed in Dachau was liberty. And there were other odd events while working on this book. Some I talk about, some I don't, some are very private. Like one, spending a week in May 2017 with Tibetan monks who were making a sand mandala at a yoga center near me in Baltimore. On their last night, the monks destroyed the mandala that they had laboriously made over the preceding 7 days. While sitting on the floor of the room where they made the mandala, I spread out some photos of Noor and her parents to show to a friend who, like me, was completely enamored with the story. Suddenly, I heard somebody ask if I would like a small plastic bag that contained several teaspoons of sand from the mandala. It's what's traditionally done after mandala is demolished. And looking up, there was a beautiful boy who was maybe 5 or 6 years old. I asked his name. "Thurston," he said. He then spelled it, Thurston, and then he added, "My birthday is January 1st. Well, Noor's birthday is January 1st. A friend who was with me said, "Noor is with you everywhere." Researching this book took me to France, Germany, and England, to archives in churches and convents, to a death camp, to Sufi retreats, Noor's family's home near Paris, to elementary schools where students had done lengthy projects on Noor, and to the town where Noor lived before the war, which now has a street and a school named after her. And everywhere I went, people were eager to talk about Noor. That was a relief from some of my other books, which too often were about bad guys or shady guys or guys with incredibly bad judgment. I wrote a book about a rabbi who hired a hitman to kill his wife. I wrote a book about an enormously successful Jewish mind reader who stupidly got too close to some of the top Nazis in Berlin in the 1930s. I wrote a book about the head of the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, who's made highly inflammatory statements about Jews and whites and about many African Americans. These aren't guys you want to hang around with too much. Immersing myself into the life of a good person, Noor, and not these rascals, was a completely different experience. Those guys were cautionary tales. They represent what we should not do in life. Noor models how we should behave, especially how we should behave toward each other. Her influence was surprising, and looking back in time, it was probably inevitable. For instance, at some point while writing the book, I was profusely thanking someone who had done me a very small favor. "And that's enough," she said. "What's the matter with you?" "Oh," I said, "you're right. But Noor's made me a better person, and I want to thank you profusely." And so I did. Got really bothersome after a while, but I did. Another time I was irked at somebody who hadn't done what I'd asked her to do, though I was sure she would have benefited from it. For 2 days, I didn't talk with her. Then I kicked myself. If Noor could forgive a member of the resistance who other resistants were sure had betrayed her to the Germans, don't judge, Noor told them. Not judging was the Sufi way. Then I could forgive my friend for the smallest of infractions, and I did. Given Noor's slow, steady influence on me, most of which I was unaware of as it was occurring, I should have not have been surprised what happened when I visited Noor's family's home opposite Paris for the first time. Maia, if we could have the next slide. Thank you very much. A friend had given me a verse from the Quran to read at what I thought was an appropriate time in an appropriate place. When I walked into this room, it's called the Oriental Room in Noor's family's home, that I decided was the appropriate place. So I reached into my backpack, pulled that page of the Quran out, that photocopy, and I went to a small desk in this room. There were several photos of Noor on it. It was almost a shrine. And I instantly, and without thinking and impulsively and instinctively, fell on my knees and read this to those photos. And I'm not the kind of guy who falls on his knees. So decades after her death in 1944, Noor is still capable of stirring passions, of encouraging the committed, of comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. And that's how it should be, since Noor's creed embraced honor, truth, duty, service, and love, all of which we can benefit from today. Maia, next slide. Thank you very much. In our age of runaway mendacity, Noor's adherence to truth is an indispensable reminder of the power of honesty. Truth, she believed, is all the religion there is. It is truth which will save us. In our age of expediency and moral turbulences, Noor's devotion to honor is a lesson in fortitude and tenacity. Her honor was sacred to her. She refused to violate it, even to avoid being sent from a comfortable prison in Paris to a hellhole in Germany. In our age of political timidity and calculation, Noor's constancy and fearlessness are a needed compass for now. We better ourselves, she said, by rising to the challenges of life. We experience joy, her word, joy, by helping others, even by sacrificing ourselves for them. In our age of mass shootings, crimes against minorities and the powerless, Noor's innate peacefulness is a lesson in the force of compassion and gentleness. Harm no one for your own benefit, she believed. Have regard for the feelings of every soul. And during this pandemic, most of us have unknowingly conducted ourselves according to Noor's code. Consider your responsibility sacred. Prove trustworthy in all your dealings. Be firm in faith through life's tests and trials. One of the best parts of working on this book was meeting wonderful people wherever I went. There was a couple in London who stopped almost everything to escort me to sites in London and beyond London that figured into Noor's story. There was a third grader in a school in France that's named after Noor. And when I asked the class what they learned from Noor, he began waving his arms like crazy. He was right in front of me. I had to call on him. There was no way to get around him. He said, I learned from Noor that we should always help other people. If my sister falls into a hole, I will pull her out. And that was very sweet of him. Maia, if we could have the next slide, thank you. And there was a Sufi in Munich who came to Dachau and spent hours showing me the different spots that corresponded to what had happened to Noor, detail after detail. The two of us told many good jokes that evening. I assure you we needed them. And there was the Mother Superior of the convent next to Noor. For the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a memorial service there every September 13th, the date that Noor was killed there in 1944. This Mother Superior, Sister Ermengarde, even has a photo of Noor on my desk. I interviewed her for about an hour. And about halfway through the interview, I glanced at the crucifix hanging on the wall next to us, and I said, I'm sure you pray to Jesus. I'm sure you pray for Jesus. Do you pray for Noor? No, no, she answered. I pray with Noor. And there was Mary, Noor's 88-year-old sister-in-law. When I asked Mary, when I interviewed her in Noor's family home near Paris, what was in Noor's nature that led her from believing in fairies and writing numerous poems about them all the way into her teens to resisting the Nazis, then trying to escape twice from a heavily guarded prison in Paris? Mary paused for a moment. Then she looked directly into my eyes and she said, Noor always believed in the unbelievable. That may be the ultimate lesson from Noor. We should always believe in the unbelievable, in the far-fetched and the good, in our incredible capacity for courage, and in our unquenched quest for truth, for wisdom, and for ourselves. For we are more than what we seem, and the world is more than what we see. And even the most unlikely of us can make the most improbable of differences in the short time allotted to us on this earth. Even if, as Noor said, our hearts are broken. At that juncture, she was sure, as I am sure, that the real comes forth and our real work begins. Thank you very much. Hey, where have you been all this time?
Oh, we've been in the background. Arthur, I wanted to, well, to thank you, first off, for taking the time to meet with us and others and to recount Noor's life with us. I think in many ways, it's a very vivid and powerful tale, and she's a quite striking figure, right? So she's in many ways larger than life, despite, as you kind of pointed out, her kind of diminutive size. One of the questions I had for you is, you know, in many ways, her fate is quite a sad one, you know, and we've actually had a chance to talk a bit about Noor prior to this, and you had mentioned that you don't quite see her story that way. You don't see it as a sad story. And you've kind of touched upon that a bit, but I was wondering if you could kind of sort of address that a bit more for those who see her tale as sort of, you know, an unfortunate cost of war and sacrifice.
Yeah. This is the first talk I've given on Noor. It's not to say I haven't talked a lot about Noor. My friends have had many earaches from my many conversations with them about Noor. But this is my first formal talk. And when the book comes out in about 6 or 7 weeks, I'll give many more talks, I hope, about Noor. And I hope a few are actually in person and not on Zoom, because this is a little bit unnerving. As you can tell, perhaps you could tell, I'm not sure what was transmitted, I'm very moved by Noor's story. And it drew tears as I was talking. Those were tears more of Noor being emblematic to me of the power of faith, of the power of goodness, of the power of certainty about why we're here. And lo, if only I had that same certainty. So yes, I greatly grieve Noor's execution at Dachau, September 13th, 1944. And I'm looking forward to being a speaker at that memorial service this coming September, if indeed I can travel. But Noor, I see as a living presence. And because she was living, and because she's almost tangible, And because she's affected me, in the few examples I gave you, I find her very uplifting. And I find her surety in her mission, in what her father taught her, in everything she practiced, and everything she wrote about. Not tragic, despite her death, but enlightening and ensuring and comforting. If somebody can go to her death the way she did, knowing she had done good, knowing she had advanced goodness in the world, knowing that she had nudged victory just a little bit further, and still be able to say liberté as a Nazi held a gun to her head. What does that say about all the rest of us? What's the standard that sets for us? To me, that's an exquisite standard. And I know I'm going to fall short of it. But I also know it doesn't sadden me. It makes me happy to know that people like that existed. It makes me happy to know that probably somewhere there are people like that today. I would like to meet them. So,
well, and in many ways, then it's somewhat aspirational too. The idea that you have sort of someone who can have this sense of purpose and selflessness. It kind of leads in some ways into another question that I'd had for you is, so mysticism, Sufism were a key part of Noor's identity, her upbringing, her kind of guiding ethos. And it's interesting because in your own kind of research, your own writing, spiritualism, religion are kind of key elements of that. So I was curious if you could speak more about your relationship with Sufism, and the ways that this has sort of brought you in closer or not, maybe, to the kind of Sufi community.
I knew about Sufism. As I said earlier, I knew about Hazrat Inayat Khan, Noor's father. But I had very little contact with the Sufi community. You know, a brush with the abode of the message, the Sufi community in upstate New York, a long time ago. And that was actually more because of what they were doing with alternative energy there than what they were doing spiritually. But because of my adventures and journeys and experience for many decades now with various spiritualities, primarily Buddhism and Hinduism, a little bit of Hasidism, I was receptive to what Sufism was teaching. I was receptive in particular to Hazrat Inayat Khan's very universal version of Sufism. Yes, Sufism does extend from Islam, and certain forms of Sufism do borrow from other mysticisms and other religions. Hazrat Inayat Khan took this to a level that had never occurred before. And that's why the Sufis to this day within Hazrat Inayat's school have what they call a universal service, where they recite different verses from different faiths. I, by the way, along the way, have called myself an honorary Sufi. I have to make a certificate for myself and frame it someday. I feel very comfortable with Sufis. Of the many, many spiritual communities I've delved into and experienced and participated in over the years, I find them about the most down to earth, the most least pretentious, the most generous, and the most welcoming. And because Noor's father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, taught a mysticism, a Sufism that asks you not to move yourself away from the world, Noor certainly didn't. I find the Sufis I've encountered here in the United States and in Europe to be very present and not trying to remove themselves in any way from you or from the world. They are as in this moment as many, many, many other people I have found. And someday, I just hope they declare me more than an honorary Sufi. Actually, I have a joke with a friend. She says, not only am I an honorary Sufi, but I'm a Tzaddik, which is a Hasidic wise man. I'm not. And I am a Bodhisattva, which is a form of incarnation of the Buddha, and I'm not. But it's fun to have all these identities. If I can say one thing more about Bodhisattvas, okay, 1939, a book of short stories written by Noor was published. It's called 20 Jataka Tales. They're roughly 500 Jataka tales. They're traditional Buddhist stories, rather short. In each one, the Buddha takes a different form, a different reincarnation. He's a different animal. He might be a woodchuck, he might be an elephant, he might be a tiger, he might be a monkey, and so on. But in each story, he sacrifices himself for his community, for the goodness of that community, for the survival of that community. That was published the year the war broke out. 3-4 years later, Noor was engaging in exactly what the Bodhisattvas were doing. She was offering herself for the goodness and the survival of the world, of humanity. Not saying she was a bodhisattva, although in the course of research, I did get together with a guy who's an expert on bodhisattvas. And in fact, he's, on Jatakas, and he's a longtime Buddhist. And he said, of course Noor is a bodhisattva. I said, I don't have the right to declare anybody as a bodhisattva. He wanted to, and that's good for him. And he believes that, and his wife believes that. If she was a bodhisattva, I have even more respect for her. But I'm not privy to that sort of information.
One of the things I wanted to mention too, and again, we've had the privilege of talking prior to this, is that you had mentioned, so there's all these phenomenal photographs that you've included in your presentation. You have sort of pictures of Noor sort of during the interwar years, pictures of her as a baby with her father, with her American mother. And you had mentioned to me that there's a bit of a story behind these photos in terms of your collection or access to them. So I was wondering if you might speak a bit about how you came upon some of these sort of beautiful, beautiful pictures.
Well, some of those photos, particularly the photos of Noor from a child all the way to the time she was an adult, came from her family and from Sufi archives in The Hague and in Suresnes opposite Paris. And they've all been very, very generous with me, and I'm deeply appreciative. There was that photo of a picture of Noor, a candle next to it. As I said, that's the memorial that's held for her at Dachau every September. But some other photos, the first one, the one that we started with, the one of Noor's mother, Aura, that came to me in an email. Wonderful stuff came to me on emails. And and there was no hint in the message of the email what it was. And I opened it, and there's this astoundingly beautiful, riveting woman, Noor's mother. And once again, I was stunned at the beauty of this entire family. I had never seen photos of Aura before. There are other photos, and we weren't able to use them here, of the ship that Noor and her family took from France over to England. In some of my reading, I found the name, the SS Kosango, really beat up Belgian freighter, and bugs everywhere. Great research. I found it, and after 2 days of negotiating, I was given the rights to it to use in my book. That photo of the execution at the fort near Noor's home. One of my trips to Suresnes I hired a guide to take me through Suresnes and also through Paris. And while walking through Paris and getting terribly sore feet, we went to the fort. I really had little idea that it had anything to do with Noor's story. But we went to this site that was shown in the photo where the Germans were executing people. And suddenly I realized this is just a few blocks away from Noor's home. And it clicked on me that when Noor was going door to door trying to find a neighbor who would let her use a radio under their roof, the Germans were executing people blocks away. And I was referring earlier to the Germans who were on that block where Noor was sending messages in Suresnes. On my first visit, I think I went to the Historical Society. Most of the meeting there was kind of futile because he didn't speak English. I can't speak French. Somehow, with great sign language, I was able to ask him if he knew of any documentation that showed the German presence in Suresnes during the war. He suddenly was really happy. He reached down, he photocopied like a 15-page document for me that listed address by address by address, all the homes, houses, businesses that the Germans occupied during the war, what brigade they were from in the German army, whether they were Gestapo, whether they were German police, and how many lived in each place. And that's how I was able to calculate how many Germans were living on the same block where Noor was sending a message from. So accidentally sometimes, pure luck other times, through the graciousness of people in archives and through the graciousness of the family, I amassed an awful lot of material, and I'm grateful to everyone.
And it's kind of a remarkable the way that the pieces, the different threads of the story then start to come together, as you were saying, the realization of sort of the Noor's life and her place. Yeah, it's fascinating. I did want to say, so I realize in some ways the hour grows late, so I do have a couple more questions for you, but perhaps if there are audience members who have questions, they could pose them in the Q&A. Maybe I can prompt you with another question now while we gather a few of those. But for those of you who haven't used the Q&A function, as Maya had mentioned earlier, it should be either at the very bottom or top of your screen. So please feel free to add a few there now if you'd like. And while we wait for that, I did want to mention that the book has already received some excellent advanced reviews. So I believe that Maya had included some of those in the email prompt. So I think, fortunately, some of the audience members have had a chance to read through them. But I was curious about how some of these had come about. And I think you'd mentioned that there were some that you'd especially liked, or there were some stories behind some of this. So, yeah.
Yeah. Comments and reviews have been coming in for several weeks now. And some were recruited by my publisher, and some have been in Kirkus Review. I know there's going to be one soon in Library Journal. When the first comment on the book came from a British writer, Amanda Foreman, and I had never heard of her. If you ever run into Amanda, please don't tell her that. She's written apparently a number of bestsellers, and she's highly regarded in the United Kingdom. So I did some research on Amanda. Who is this woman who was saying wonderful things about my book? And indeed she did, and thank you very much, Amanda. So, came across the list of her books. I was impressed. Then I saw on Wikipedia that her father was a fellow named Carl Foreman, and that rang a bell. So I Googled Carl Foreman, and then I realized that this very sweet woman who I never met, who was saying kind things about my book, was the daughter of the guy who wrote Bridge Over the River Kwai and High Noon, two of my favorite films. So I was almost more excited that I got a blurb from the daughter of the guy who did this than from Amanda Foreman herself. One of my favorite comments on the book came from somebody in my publisher's house. She works in the in the production part of W.W. Norton. And she emailed me as she was reading the book and trying to piece it all together and design it. I'm reduced to tears every few pages. And this will sound really mean, but I was truly gratified. That's what I wanted to happen. And I got an email from her when I was visiting a daughter in Maine. My daughter came down for breakfast, and I said, Amy, I'm so happy. I just made somebody cry. So comments come from many different directions. They've almost uniformly been extraordinarily positive, and they make me very excited because I truly believe this is a story that we need to hear about today. And if people can react to this book and to Noor's story as they have been so far and embracing her and this book so far, I'm looking at the bottom now. Hi there, Lenny, how are you? Not to sound too cocky, but I believe I've done my job and I've done it reasonably well. The fellow who just had a message at the screen, Lenny, is an old friend of mine from 1535 Walton Avenue, Bronx, 52, New York.
Ah, so friends from across time and space.
Yes.
So we do have a few questions from the audience. So if you're all right with that, I'll kind of, we can field a few of these for you to answer. So at the top, we have Toby LaRoche, who mentioned, in your travels while researching for this book, have you met other people who inspire you in similar ways?
It's a very good question. I've met many people who have inspired me and surprised me and convinced me that there is goodness and the world isn't as crummy as it often seems. Here comes the qualifier. No. I haven't found anybody who has inspired me as much as Noor. I found people who also are enamored and inspired by Noor. I found people who use their spirituality and their knowledge of faith to make this a better world. But to go against the Nazis as Noor did, to me, is virtually inconceivable. I can't imagine that. And I can't imagine, hi there, Tim, how do you do? I can't imagine a young woman, small, diminutive, as I said, never prone to arguing with anybody, never prone to fighting with anybody, doing what she did. She truly rose to that occasion. If every day each of us could rise just a fraction to the occasion that we meet, it would be a wonderful planet that's sorely besieged by this pandemic and other factors I don't want to go into in this moment. So no, sad to say, but honest to say, I haven't met anybody who inspires me as much as
Noor. We have a comment from Kenny, who I believe might be your psychologist friend. It says, your psychologist friend wants you to speculate on how Noor might, as a modest person, want to be remembered, understanding that, you know, you can only infer some of these things, but he goes on to thank you and to thank Marlboro. So how might Noor want to be remembered in this day and age?
Thank you, Kenny. Yes, he is my psychologist friend, and also I've known Kenny since 5th grade. This is a great evening for like old timers. Lenny from the Bronx, Kenny originally from Scranton, Pennsylvania, now Minneapolis. How would Noor like to be remembered? I've thought about that. I've also thought about what would she possibly have done after the war. How would she like to be remembered? And thank you, Kenny, for saying that she's a modest person. I truly believe that. I truly believe she was a very, very humble person. I think she would have been content to continue to write children's stories, to be married, to have 1 or 2 or 3 children, and not to have a fuss made about her. She possibly would have assisted, guided, advised her brother Vilayat, who was the successor to Hazrat Inayat Khan's group, both in the United States and in Europe. Vilayat was a little bit more flamboyant than Noor, but even if she had advised him and corrected him sometimes, she would have done so behind the scenes and very quietly. I've wondered also how Noor would like my writing a book about her. 2 women before me have written books about Noor. I would hope that she would recognize that her example is what we need today. Her inspiration is what we need today. I'm not exalting Noor as a personality. I'm exalting and appreciating Noor, I hope, as somebody who can guide us, especially through the traumas and the darkness that we face today. So Noor, after the war, if indeed she had survived, would have led a very quiet and unassuming life. And the historical Noor, who was killed at Dachau, getting all these messages at the bottom of the screen, this is fun. Noor, the historical Noor, who was killed at Dachau, lived a very modest and quiet life. She would like to be remembered modestly and quietly. I would like to think she's an ally of mine in this endeavor, and I'd like to think that I have not taken away from the privacy and the quiet that she enveloped herself in, but that being a scholar of mysticisms, a practitioner of a particular mysticism, I don't think Noor would have had any problem with being recognized through my book. Can you give me a call? Let me know if you think that was satisfying.
Yeah, we'll have some follow-up to make sure that all answers are satisfactory.
Okay.
It looks like we have 3 more questions right now in the Q&A. So if you'd like, we can kind of go through those. And then maybe if others have questions in the future, we can have them reach out to you directly if they're curious. So a question from Suzanne Payne is, can you talk more about what Noor did to help D-Day?
Certainly. Well, there was that message that she sent to England, probably August or early September 1943, asking the British to send a plane in to get 2 French agents. She didn't know it. Oh, that's right. She called it a basket of cherries. She said these 2 agents had a basket of cherries. I forgot about that until right now, even though it's in my book. The basket of cherries detailed German placements throughout Brittany. When Free French tied up with the resistance about 2 weeks before D-Day itself, they decimated the German communication system in that region. They blew up dozens of petrol dumps. They stopped 100,000 troops from getting from Brittany over to Normandy. That's the prime way that she contributed to D-Day. If 100,000 extra German troops had gotten over to Normandy, most likely Normandy would have been a complete failure. Noor also was able to find out through this fellow I mentioned before, Pierre Vianon, the kind of code the Germans were using to advise German subs about Allied ships, Allied bombers. She was also able, through Vianon, to learn where this equipment was made. Actually, one of her last few days in Paris before she was caught, she and a member of the resistance blew up a small shed that had hundreds of these little devices that were used on submarines. So again, bit by bit, incrementally, she was able to stall, discourage, dismay, and dismantle the German effort.
That's great. And we have another one from Tim Mayo who says, where in Suresnes did Noor live? He asked because he has some friends who live there in Paris. So
they were her, those guys are Noor's neighbor. My French. Tim, I will send you the exact address. I don't want to do it here. But if you have been in Suresnes, there's a steep hill, the village itself and where the shops are, a very flat region right next to the Seine, but then it gets very, very steep. In fact, at the top of that hill is where the fort is, where the Germans were executing resistance during the war itself. Noor's home is, let's say, 3/4 the way up that slope. It's about half a mile or so from the railroad station, the metro station in Suresnes. But I'm going to send you, Tim, the exact address, and your friends can go there. It's really a wonderful house. I wish we had some photos of the house during the slideshow. I started out, if you remember, by saying once upon a time there was a princess. The more I immersed myself in this story, the more I was convinced this was almost a fairy tale. Yes, Noor's father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, was Indian royalty. That's where Noor got her regal qualities from and her regal heritage. But aside from Noor being a princess, the house the family has in Suresnes is like a castle, straight out of a fairy tale. And we saw a photo earlier of, Noor's father, Hazrat Inayat Khan. To me, he looks like an Old Testament patriarch. We just don't see people like that today. So Suresnes is a wonderful little town. The family is talking about turning the house into a museum, and that would be wonderful. And I hope they do that. And if my book does well, I just happen to have a copy here. Everybody should purchase it or pre-order. I've told them if Codename Madeleine does reasonably well, I will financially assist them to preserving Fazal Manzil, the House of Blessings, and ensuring that it remains for future generations. And it's a place for Sufi gatherings, but also a place for school children to come to, for people like me to come to, total strangers, as I was at the origins of the story. Places where people can learn about peace, where people can learn about faith, where people can learn about courage, and the persistence of continuing against all odds. And I return to that theme again and again. And I think these days, in this culture, in this nation, we are facing a regime that is is possibly as fascistic and narrow-minded and scary and repressive as what Noor faced. And if she had the temerity to do what she did, we can certainly send in our ballots by mail and more. A long answer, Tim. I'll email you. Remind me, Tim, to on email to send you the address.
And I will say we have one last question from the Q&A, which we have time for now, from Javed Chowdhury, who says, did you find any information about possible contacts between Alan Turing and Noor when she was at SOE? Alan Turing, of course, another remarkable figure during this time.
No, absolutely none, although it's a great question, and I wish there was contact. No, he was ensconced trying to break the Enigma code. She was in 3 or 4 different SOE training centers throughout England, even in Scotland. No contact at all. And she was not necessarily a code breaker. She was taught code, and that's what she played fair code. And that's what she used when she got over to France. but she had nothing to do with Alan Turing. Although, if I wrote fiction, that would make a hell of a yarn.
Well, I want to thank both of you, Arthur and Ian, so much for joining us tonight. Wow, I've really learned a lot, and this has been such a great evening to provide perspective on even where we are right now in this moment, and how much bigger the world is, but also how important our actions are right now. And one of those actions is all of you who decided to join us tonight. And I'm really grateful to all of you who were able to attend. We are hoping to host additional alumni speaker series events via Zoom in the next couple of months or so. And we'll keep you informed of that. And I will also email out the link to pre-order Arthur's book to everyone that attended. And also, if you have any additional questions, you can email Arthur. Arthur, do you mind giving your information?
Certainly, I don't mind at all. Yes, feel free to email me with any comments or questions. Email address is amagida2@aol.com. I will spell that out for you. You don't need the AOL part. AMAGIDA2, number 2 not spelled out, to @aol.com. amagida2@aol.com. And you can certainly go to my website. There's an excerpt there from the book. There's more information about Moore. There's more information about me. The website is www.arthurmagida.com.
Great. Well, thank you again, everybody, so much. Good night, and please take care of yourself and your people. Take care.
Thank you, Maya.
You're welcome.